Welcome back, Legion. Today I want to talk to you guys about a simple way to measure your training load. First of all, what is training load? So training load is basically the work that you're doing while you're playing your specific sport or training for your specific sport. Now, depending on your sport, this could a lot of the time be the amount of running load that you're doing while playing the sport. It definitely correlates to swimmers as well, so the amount of time that you're spending in the pool. But essentially it's the amount of time and work that you're putting into your sport-specific training. This can also carry over to specific conditioning sessions as well. That's definitely a part of the training load if there's a combo of the two. You can also factor in your weight training sessions, but they do differ a little bit, and we tend to separate those training load stimuluses into separate categories. So it's important to understand why we should measure training load. It's a great way to monitor whether you're doing enough training or too much training. The way we can think about this is the story of Goldilocks. So too little training and we get an understimulus. Now the risk with an understimulus is that one, you're not improving your performance, so you're not actually getting any better. And then two, you're putting yourself at risk of injury for when you go and play your competition. If your competition is too high in its training, in its load demand, as in it's a lot more intense and arduous than the training that you've been doing, then the risk of getting injured goes up because you're not physically prepared to undertake that that situation. Too much, and you start to delve into overtraining. So where the training amount is more or greater than your ability to recover. So what happens is instead of getting better, you actually start getting worse because the fatigue is greater than your ability to recover and improve your fitness or your general performance. So we want that sweet spot. Just enough training load to get a stimulus, to get a hit, to see an improvement, but not so much that we tip over the edge and we can't recover from it and it becomes too much. It's also important to understand, really, when we're looking at training load, we're just wanting to avoid too greater spikes and too greater drop-offs. That's where it becomes a little bit risky. You're not always going to get injured off the back of those, but doing too much load in a week and then doing too little in a week can definitely put you at the risk of getting injured if you haven't well prepared. So that's why we're looking for that sweet spot, coming back to as much consistency in your training load as possible. So here's a simple way to measure your training load. Very low tech, little bit of math, but pretty straightforward. So the place to start off with is understanding your rate of perceived exertion, or RPE. So RPE is basically how hard do you think you worked in that session. We can use a simple scale of 1 to 10, 1 being your at rest, so me just sitting here, and 10 being the absolute hardest you can possibly work, and it's probably only for a short period of time. Think of a session where you might have vomited from, or the hardest training session that you've ever done. That's a 10. So once you've established your rate of perceived exertion, so how hard was the session, you can put that against the time or how long it took to take that session. So it's RPE times time, okay? So if your session went for 2 hours and your RPE was a 8 out of 10, you now get an arbitrary load. And it's arbitrary because the number doesn't really mean anything, but it is something that we can still measure and monitor against itself. So what do we say? RPE 8, 2-hour training session, so 120. That gives us a training load of 120 minutes. We try and do the time factor in minutes. So 8 times 120 gives us 1600, and that's your arbitrary unit. That's your training load for that session. Now what you can start to do is plot this over the sessions for the week and accumulate that total for the week, and then you can start to measure it week to week. So from session to session, it's relatively safe to have those changes in training load, it's probably that week-to-week effect. Ideally, we want to keep it between 10 and 20% in regards to your increases in training load. So any higher than 20% and your risk for injury just increases. It becomes too much of an increase in training load. This isn't necessarily saying you're going to get injured, but increases bigger than that can be a bit of a risk. And then the higher your training load gets, I'd say the lower those increases need to be. So if your training load's quite low, making 20% jumps isn't too much of an issue. But then as it's getting higher, like if you're doing a lot of training and you're making 20% jumps, that's going to be pretty risky. So at the start, you can make greater jumps, but then as you're getting higher and higher in your training phase, you need to reduce those training load jumps. Now, if you do this and you start to measure and monitor your training load, what you find is you'll be able to get more consistent, and then you'll be able to see whether the amount of training that you're doing is enough to get better. And at the same time, if it's not too much so that you're getting worse. And it's also great to, if you ever do unfortunately get injured, to look back at those training loads and to see if it was a training load error. Maybe you did have one of those spikes, and maybe it was 4 weeks later before you actually got injured, but that spike could have contributed to that injury down the track. Okay guys, that's a simple way to put training load. You can definitely go a lot deeper than this, and I might make some more videos about it in the future. But for now, this is a great start. All right, cheers.